Hello Internet, AdoptedMike here, and in this video we're going to take a look at this MSI motherboard. It's the X470 Gaming Plus. So this is for the AMD Ryzen 1000 and 2000 series. The X370 was the first one, and now we've moved up to the X470 chipset. However, it is backwards compatible, being it is the AM4 socket. So anyway, let's take a look at this motherboard. On the back of the box you can see a picture of the motherboard as well as some of the features like RGB Mystic Light. We've got audio boost, turbo USB, turbo M.2, easy debug LEDs, X boost, and then as well as some of other specifications and an I/O overview. But let's get the board out of the box and actually take a look at it, and we'll go through some of the features close up. But before we get to the board, let's take a look at the included accessories. Okay, we've got a piece of cardboard there, and behind it we've got a I/O shield that's got some color and graphics on it, so not the standard silver I/O shield. We've got a couple of SATA connectors. Then we've got a couple of these tiny little screws that will work for the M.2 slots to screw the device down. We get a case badge with the MSI Dragon. We get some drivers and utilities on disk, and then looks like we also get some cable labels. We get a thank you for purchasing quick installation guide. We get a case standoff notification, okay, pointing out to some of the circuitry underneath the board that we need to watch out for. And then the X470 Gaming Plus manual. Now let's take a look at the board. Okay, so here's the board out of the bag. You can see we've got a black and red scheme going on with MSI's gaming line. We've got a couple of heat sinks on the VRMs that feel of decent quality. There's some fins in here a little bit, so that would definitely help with heat dissipation if you plan on overclocking. One of the other things that I like to see in a board with overclocking in mind is more CPU power delivery. So we have an 8-pin that's usually pretty standard, and then we also have an additional 4-pin to give the CPU some more power or more stable power depending on the power supply and other factors like cooling that may help get a little bit higher frequencies on CPUs. Then next to the AM4 socket here, we've got our 4 RAM slots, so we can hold 16 gigabytes per RAM slot, and that supports up to 34-33 megahertz. So one thing you have to think about though too, you may or may not get that depending on the overclock on the CPU or the CPU itself, whether or not you're able to hit that max. But the board says it will support up to that, so if you're lucky you may be able to get your RAM overclocked to that, although in most people's experience it doesn't really make a huge difference. But it is kind of neat the fact that the board could get up to that depending on the CPU, like I said. And then we can kind of move along here and take a look at the PCI Express. So if you're just looking for PCI Express slots, we've got 3 ones that are for graphics and then 3x1s. Obviously if you're going to use one graphics card, your best bet is to put it in this first one, and then you get a x16 connection. If you use Crossfire, you can get up to 3 ways, so 1, 2, and 3, so you'd be x8, and then x4, although this bottom one is PCI Express 2.0. So triple Crossfire, which is not even really supported anymore, you know, probably something you don't want to do with this. Dual Crossfire though would be a decent bet, and then you'd have x8 on PCI Express 3.0, so that would be a worthwhile deal there, you know, depending on your situation. Also to note too, we've got our M.2 slots, which do affect a little bit of the PCI Express bandwidth. This one, if you're going to use a boot device or a high-speed storage, you're going to get a higher speed out of that top one, as it supports PCI Express 3.0, and there's 4 lanes there going directly to the processor. This one down here is PCI Express 2.0, and so it'll be a little slower. So if you were going to use a fast NVMe, I would definitely put it up top there. And then keep in mind too, the APUs have a different amount of PCI Express available, so you don't only end up with a x2 here and a x8 here, and then 0, 0. So you have to think about that. This board is really not designed well or in mind for an APU, you'd probably definitely want to go with the Ryzen series on this. Otherwise, you're going to be drastically reducing your bandwidth in all PCI Express add-in cards. All that being said, your best bet for NVMe storage, like I said, is right here, where you're going to get a 3.0 by 4 connection on a Ryzen processor, and then down here could be secondary if you want to do a PCI Express 2.0 connection here, or SATA for the M.2 drive. And then using this in SATA mode will disable SATA 1 on the 6 ports over here, and then using this in PCI Express mode will completely disable this PCI Express by 2 slot. So there's something to think about there, and that will only be on the Ryzen processors, not the APUs. The APUs, like I said before, don't get as many lanes and to the processor, so you definitely you know, all of this applies only to Ryzen. There's significant hits to the APUs. Alright, now continuing around the board, like we talked about before, we've got a 4 and an 8 pin CPU power up here that should be plenty of power to run the CPU and doing some overclocking as well. We've got our 24 pin in there, and then as far as fan headers go, we've got a CPU 4 pin fan header there. We've got a 4 pin fan header there. There's one there, one there, and one there. So there's a total of 4 for chassis fans, one for the CPU, and then this one up here is a 2 amp 4 pin pump. So that's where you'd want to hook your pump to if you were going to use any kind of water cooling pump. That way you get a little more amperage out of it to handle a high performance pump. We also get some the RGB headers. There's one there and then one down there as well too for the RGB function of the board should you decide to use it. And then that kind of will wrap up the general overview of the board. So let's take a look at some of the back panel, and then we can take a run on the bottom as well too. So the back panel here, we've got a PS2 port that could be keyboard or mouse. We've got 2 USB 2.0 ports, and then if you had an APU or CPU with dedicated graphics built in, then you would be able to use this DVI port, dual link, or the HDMI port. But like I said, if you've got a Ryzen CPU, you're going to have to go with dedicated graphics on this one because these will not be usable. Then we have 4 USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports. We've got a gigabit Realtek Ethernet, and we have 2 USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports back here, and we've got our audio out with a SPDIF. Now let's take a look at some of the other connectors on the board for peripherals. Along the bottom here we've got our front panel audio. We've talked about before the RGB header there. We've got that system fan. There's also a clear CMOS button. We've got a COM port if you need one, and parallel printer if you happen to need one of those too. Although at this point these are getting kind of to be definitely legacy, and I wouldn't be surprised if relatively soon we see these disappear as USB is so prominent now. We've got a USB 2.0 header here, and we've got another USB 2.0 header. We've got a USB 3.0 header here, and moving along there's the front panel connectors and a speaker. And we go this way on the board. We've got, scoot down a bit. Got our 6 SATA connectors, and then one of these are disabled if we use that M.2 key. We've got another USB 3.0 header here as well too, a right angle, and then we move back around. We've got our 24 pin power like we saw before, and then the system fan 3 and the pump fan. So that kind of wraps up the board itself. We can take a quick look at the back. So it's entirely black, and we've got the standard AMD brace there, and then some of the other logos that we have to watch out for. These particular standoffs we saw in one of the manuals thing, to be careful that we don't ground these points out. And anyway, that wraps up this video on the MSI X470 Gaming Plus motherboard. Again, it's an AMD board. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them below, or any comments. and I hope you guys enjoyed the video and found it useful. And as always, thank you for watching.